This is lecture 11.3 for Psych 440, Affirmative Action. Now, affirmative action is a fairly controversial topic, but it's one that certainly does affect the lives of people applying for jobs as well as people who are in charge of making those hiring decisions. So I think it's important that we spend a little bit of time to talk about some of the facts compared to some of the myths and misperceptions about affirmative action and the idea of giving preference in the hiring process to members of a particular group. So I'd like to cover some widespread misperceptions and realities about who engages in affirmative action and preferential hiring, when and under what circumstances these are legal or required, and what a typical organization's affirmative action plan is likely to look like. So let's start with one widely held view about what affirmative action is. In the question over to the right, is affirmative action defined as the practice of giving preference to minority applicants over majority applicants? That is a widely held, widely debated misperception about what affirmative action is. Affirmative action, as it's defined by the EEOC, has nothing to do with how you make the final hiring decision. Instead, affirmative action is focused on recruitment. Affirmative action is good faith efforts to increase the pool of qualified minorities and females in your applicant pool. The idea being here, not that you're necessarily going to prefer these applicants, but that you're at least going to encourage them to be in the applicant pool. You're at least going to give them a fair chance to be considered in your hopefully fair and unbiased, non-adverse impact causing selection process. So affirmative action plans generally consist of 4 possible strategies. The first and most common is keeping track of your hiring and promotion statistics, paying attention to how many members of different ethnic groups or genders you're hiring for different kinds of positions, keeping track of their promotion rate. This can be a good early check to see if there might be a possibility of adverse impact, or if there might be something you want to be concerned about. Affirmative action often looks like very actively recruiting minority group applicants, and sometimes it's even more active than that. It's about trying to identify and then remove barriers or perceived barriers for people from different underrepresented backgrounds applying to your organization, being hired in your organization, or being promoted and being successful in your organizations. Preferential hiring is sometimes an admissible affirmative action strategy, but there are some very narrow limits on when and in what circumstances you can actively prefer members of one group over another. The vast majority of affirmative action plans do not involve preferential hiring. The next question for you is, who is required to engage in affirmative action? Do all companies need to be able to say, we are an affirmative action employer? The answer again there is no. Not everyone is required to engage in affirmative action. You are required to have an affirmative action plan if you are a contractor who gets some of your income from the federal government. This was signed into law as Executive Order 11246. It's a dictate from the executive branch saying the U.S. government wants its contractors to engage in affirmative action. Public sector organizations, government agencies, state and local governments who do not hire or promote enough minority employees may be court-ordered to have an affirmative action plan. A federal contractor must have one, must actively show that they're complying. A public agency might be required to have one if there's evidence that there's been a problem in the past. So an organization that's been found to have a history of discrimination, intentional or unintentional, may be ordered to have an affirmative action plan. Private sector organizations may agree to have affirmative action plans as part of a legal settlement. either an out-of-court settlement or part of the settlement of the case. Again, if they were found to have adverse impact or disparate impact in the past, they may agree to an affirmative action plan as a way to remedy that going forward. And then finally, many organizations voluntarily have affirmative action plans because they support the goals of affirmative action because they think having a more diverse workforce is valuable. So an organization stating that they are an affirmative action or equal opportunity employer doesn't necessarily mean that there's been a history of discrimination there in the past, but it might. So we have some organizations choosing to do this of their own free will, other organizations doing this because of a prior court order or a settlement, or organizations that receive money from the federal government have to do it. They don't have a choice. Now, let's talk a little bit about that issue of preferential hiring. Most of the time, affirmative action specifically outlaws preferential hiring. That executive order that we talked about in the last slide, it specifically prohibits preferential hiring or choosing to hire someone just because they represent a particular minority group. According to, right there in the language of the executive order, that is discrimination. That is illegal. However, there are a few cases when you can obtain approval, usually from a court or from the Department of Labor, to implement a preferential hiring plan, if you can argue that the plan meets a compelling government interest. So if you've followed it all, there have been a handful of cases in the state of Texas in recent years regarding the use of racial preferences in college admissions and law school admissions. The defense that the universities have made in those cases is that diversity serves the mission of a university, exposing students to a variety of other students whose backgrounds are different from their own, promoting researchers and future teachers and future professionals who come from a wide variety of backgrounds is part of the mission of a university. They've argued that their preference policies meet this compelling government interest. But in general, most private sector organizations can't make that claim. For the most part, preferential hiring is only legal in a very narrow set of circumstances. It's unlikely to be approved unless there has been a problem in the past. If there is a history of discrimination in that particular organization, so not just, hey, other organizations in our industry have had this problem, we want to be different, that's not good enough. It has to be a direct recompense for prior discrimination. In particular, preferential hiring plans tend to be legal when the hiring plan is directly intended to benefit people who were discriminated against in the past. So if an organization is found guilty of discrimination and they agree, well, okay, we will go back and give preference to those people we unfairly turned away before, that kind of preferential hiring tends to be legal. If those people have long since moved on to find other jobs, or they've said, well, we don't really want to work for you anyway if you're discriminating against us, then a preferential hiring plan is going to be acceptable under 3 very narrow conditions. One of these is that you have to make your diversity goals based on the availability of qualified employees. So you can't just say, well, our local community is 50% Hispanic, therefore we're going to hire 50% of Hispanic applicants, without reference to, well, how many of those applicants really are qualified, how easy is it to find people who really can do the job in that particular population. One of the controversial provisions is that you can't unnecessarily trammel the rights of non-minorities. And if that phrase sounds vague, well, it is. It's the subject of a lot of debate. But, for example, you couldn't say, wow, we've been discriminating against women for the past 30 years, so we're only going to hire women for the next 30 years to make up for it. That would be pretty unnecessarily trammeling the rights of men in that scenario. That kind of a preferential hiring plan would not fly. And then finally, the plan must have a defined endpoint. You can't say this is going to go on forever. The idea is that a preferential hiring plan is acceptable as a way to right a past wrong. So when you can comfortably say that that past wrong has been addressed, then the preference needs to come to an end. So the kind of preferential hiring that most people think about is not at all the kind of preferential hiring that is legal in organizations. Quotas are never legal. Quotas are policies saying, hey, out of this many employees in our organization, 50% of them must be women, 33% of them must be African American, 2% need to be Native American, and about 15% of them should probably be Jewish or Islamic. Those kinds of quotas are never legal. Many organizations have goals or objectives around numbers like that, saying, hey, in our local community, our population is about 50% Hispanic, so it would be nice if our workforce was about 50% Hispanic. You may have a goal like that, but you cannot make hiring decisions strictly to fit that goal. You cannot enforce those objectives. The other really widespread misperception about preferential hiring is that even if you have an approved, legal, accepted preferential hiring plan, that does not allow you to prefer an unqualified minority group member over a qualified majority group member. All it means is that when you have two candidates who are essentially equally qualified, you can use group membership as the tiebreaker. You can't prefer someone who is not qualified over someone who is, just on the basis of their race or their gender or their religion. Ultimately, preferential hiring plans get to be very specific, very unique to a particular organization and set of circumstances at a particular time. Affirmative action is not a blanket policy that says we have to have exactly equal numbers of every group or we have to perfectly represent the local community. Preferential hiring plans are very narrow, very precise, and very specific. There are also some misperceptions about the consequences of affirmative action plans. We just said on the last slide that you cannot hire a less qualified or an unqualified minority group member over a qualified majority group member. However, that's not the perception that's out there. There is a very widespread perception that affirmative action means hiring a less qualified person over a more qualified person, and people carry these perceptions into the way that they treat new hires in the workplace. So an employee who is hired or promoted as a result of an affirmative action plan, or who is perceived as being hired or promoted because of affirmative action, tends to be viewed as less competent by their coworkers. Even worse, these same people often view themselves as less competent. They ascribe more of their success to the affirmative action plan than to their own qualifications. So it has a negative impact not only on how they are perceived and treated, but also on how they feel about themselves. And there's some research that suggests that people who benefit from affirmative action may act even more negatively toward other beneficiaries of affirmative action in an attempt to differentiate themselves and to say, no, I'm really competent. I was hired for this job based on my qualifications, because they feel these negative perceptions and these threats. So there's some research to suggest that in the long term, affirmative action plans also have some negative impacts on the people that they were intended to benefit. Overall, at the organization level, there's quite a bit of research trying to look at benefits or consequences of increased diversity in organizations. And those findings tend to be, so far, very mixed. Lots of contradictions and lots of complexities in there. Having a great deal of diversity can improve some aspects of performance. It can also create more conflict, more tension. It tends to be a very complicated and a very difficult issue without an easy answer. Next lecture, I'm going to move on to another specific issue that's related to discrimination law in the workplace, and one that also has quite a few myths and misperceptions about it, and that's sexual harassment.